to massive open online course on Indian economics. Today I am going to discuss structural constraints and Indian development strategy, which is under the heading economic development since independence. Whenever we speak about structural constraints and Indian development strategies, we start from the objectives of this study, which you can treat it as learning objectives or learning outcomes. The first objective of this is to know about the structural constraints facing the Indian economy since independence. Since independence to late 80s and from the early 90s, that is the starting point of this liberalization regime, till now, we need to know the structural constraints. This is the first objective. The second objective is to know about the overall nature of Indian development strategy. The third objective is to know how about the different plans have fixed their strategies to tackle with these structural constraints. And finally, we want to examine to review the reforms in the context of the Indian economy. Now, whenever we have a discussion like this, we actually classify the whole topic into different parts, and here also I have divided into various parts. Now, this is the plan of the discussion. So, I shall start from a brief introduction, then I shall give you an idea of the structural constraints and the strategies of different plans, especially the initial plans starting from the first plan to sixth plan till mid 80s, and then from the late 80s and early 90s, I shall focus on the economic reforms. And then, of course, after discussing the different phases of economic reforms, in a nutshell, I shall focus on the recent strategies and policy issues in the Indian context, and I'll conclude after that. Now, whenever we start from the introduction to this topic, we consider the starting point as the time of independence, that is 15th of August 1947. And when India obtained independence, actually it was a colonial state before that, and after that it was transformed into a democratic state. Now, the question is whether its democracy in the true sense of the term is different. Say, for example, Ramchandra Guha, he has mentioned that actually constitutional democracy has been converted to populist democracy. But that is not my intention. My intention is to point out the structural constraints starting from the first 5-year plan and to focus on these structural constraints and how a strategy has been chalked by the Indian planners to overcome these structural constraints. Sometimes they are successful, sometimes they are not, and that I shall discuss today. So, basically my starting point will be the beginning of the first 5-year plan. Now, actually, when the planning era started, India's objective was to form a plan in the context of a mixed economy. It's neither a socialistic type of state nor a capitalistic type of state. Actually, what the planners they have followed, especially from the second 5-year plan, is a Soviet type of planning system in terms of Mahalanobis Nehru model. But I shall not go into the details of that because my intention is to focus on the strategies and also the structural constraints. All total, India faced 12 5-year plans, and after that, we do not have any planning commission after that. After that, it's the Niti Aayog that controls the entire system or the strategies that are taken within the Indian economy. Now, at the time of the first 5-year plan, which started from 1951 to actually it covers the period of 1951 to 56, India faced with 3 problems. First, influx of refugees. Second one was shortage of food, and the third one was mounting inflation. Now, India naturally focused on meeting these food grains problems, and the focus was on agricultural development. But the focus changed from the second 5-year plan when there was wide-scale unemployment problem. I should give credit to the planners because before that, India had a negative growth rate, and from the first 5-year plan onwards, India faced at least a positive growth rate, though the figure was not high at all. It was low, and it was natural at that time. So the second 5-year plan, it focused on industrialization with special emphasis on heavy industries. I shall deal with these strategies associated with the second 5-year plan, but as I said, the main problem was the unemployment issue at that time. And the government, I mean the planners, they have emphasized on the public sector as well in terms of its emphasis on heavy and basic industries. So actually, this is known as the Mahalanobis model, which faced a dilemma between dynamic industrialization versus static agriculture. Of course, it focused on job opportunities. And that's why the Mahalanobis model, it has not neglected the production of consumer goods industries and agriculture. But actually what happened is that consumer goods industry is basically a labor intensive industry. It focuses on employment generation. But second plan was not successful in generating employment, and as a result of which we find that after the second plan there was wide scale unemployment. The focus of the third plan was to reach the stage of takeoff to self-sustained growth, because the second plan focused on achieving takeoff, though it failed actually. And the third plan focused on agricultural development. Again, it shifted to agricultural development. And after the third plan, which was also not much successful, the growth rate remained around 3%, near about 3%. And after that, the focus shifted to fight against poverty in the name of Garibi Hatao, that is eradication of poverty. So actually, if we compare the growth rates of the GDP for the first few plans, we find that the growth rate was around 3.5 per year, and it persisted till the mid-80s. Though in the 80s there was an increase in the growth rate in the mid-80s to 5.6%, but India faced several constraints at that time. Say for example, that let me start from this 3.5% growth rate. It's known as the Hindu growth rate. Raj Krishna, the famous economist, termed it as the Hindu growth rate. But as I said, that sometimes during the mid-80s, the growth rate rose to 5.6%. But India had two major constraints at that time. One was high savings but low growth rate. That is known as the saving investment puzzle, because all the savers are not investors. So India faced that problem. The second problem was that India faced, it started from the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s, was industrial stagnation. The economists have tried to explain this stagnation of industrial production in terms of both demand side theories and supply side theories. But it persisted till the mid-80s, say till late 1980s. So that's why the growth rate that I mentioned of 5.6% was not sustainable at all. So on an average, the growth rate was around 3.5%, the Hindu rate of growth. Apart from this, India faced large-scale poverty at that time, in spite of the fact that the planners have focused on poverty eradication. So this was the situation, along with, it was coupled with fiscal deficit, rising fiscal deficit and balance of payments crisis. So when we reach the year 1991, that is the next point of discussion, that is the starting point of liberalization, privatization and globalization, India faced severe crisis. Severe crisis in the sense that at that time there was fall in the foreign exchange reserves. In 1991, India had some external debt crisis. The government was not able to make repayments on its borrowings from other countries, and also there was huge balance of payments deficit at that time. Now, what are the reasons for this financial crisis? The reasons for this financial crisis in the early 90s was, or late 80s was, lack of generation of revenue, huge expenditure on developmental purpose, mainly to eradicate poverty, but without much success, and also to tackle the problem of unemployment, again without much success, and also low income of the public sector undertakings. It led to financial crisis. Apart from this, government had huge debts, mounting debts, apart from adverse balance of payments crisis, as I said, coupled with rising prices of essential goods, which resulted in high inflation rate. So India was forced to take external help. It approached World Bank, it approached to IMF and took a loan of $7 billion from IMF. But when India took the loan from IMF in the 1990s, early 1990s, 1991, it laid down some conditions which India had to follow. These are known as the structural adjustment programs, and India had to adopt some new policies known as new economic policies at that time. Say for example, as per the dictum of IMF, India had to follow the rule like liberalization, which means reducing the role of government control, removing restrictions on the private sector, and to open up the economy by reducing the tariff rate. That is the phase of globalization. So liberalization, privatization and globalization, these three together can be referred to as LPG, which I shall refer to as LPG. So this was the strategy at that time. So if we want to have a panoramic view of the reforms, we can classify into two parts. One is the short run phase, where there are some short run measures like stabilization measures, like to control the imbalance in the economy in terms of say balance of payments deficit. Some imbalances were created and India focused on correction of these imbalances. And the second one is the long term measure, which we can refer to as structural reform policies, like say reforms in the industrial sector, reforms in the external sector, monetary sector, fiscal sectors and others. So these are also known as structural reforms. Combining these two is known as the structural adjustment program. So as I said about LPG, liberalization, privatization and globalization, all these are mainly under these long-term structural measures. Now let me clarify that what is this liberalization. Liberalization means lack of government control. So there can be some abolition of licensing, industrial licensing. So industrial sector can be given some free hand. There can be tax reduction, which we refer to as fiscal sector reform, lesser control of RBI over banks in order to invite foreign banks, which is known as financial sector reforms, change in regimes of the foreign exchange market from fixed exchange rate to flexible exchange rate, which we refer to as the foreign exchange reforms, exchange market or external reforms. These are all parts or components of liberalization. Now, if we focus on privatization, it implies greater role of the private sector and lesser role of the government. So it implies shedding of the ownership or management of a government-owned enterprise by a private company. This is the main issue of privatization. Globalization means it's integrating the economy with that of the world. How can it be done? This can be done through tariff cut to encourage foreign investors to invest in our economy, which we say as referred to as FDI. And government, of course, should not control the companies in that case. So globalization means turning into the world into a borderless world. This is the basic issue of globalization. I shall focus on each of these three issues: liberalization, privatization and globalization in more details. Say for example, liberalization. The key driver at the time of liberalization when it started was information and technology sector. Now, if we consider over the years, say since independence till the regime of liberalization, we find that initially agriculture was given priority. It was around 40% of GDP. But over the years, we find that there is a fall in the share of agriculture in GDP, and the fall is from 40% to 15% of GDP. Now, if we consider the share of the manufacturing sector in GDP, we find that the increase was quite high at the beginning of the planning era, that means during the second 5-year plan. So it increased from 15% to near about 20%. But after that, as I said, India faced industrial stagnation. So the share of manufacturing sector to GDP stagnated at around 20%, 23%. And it continued and it still persists at present also, even during the liberalization regime. We find that the share of industrial sector or the manufacturing sector has stagnated around 25%, not much increase. Then what is the major impact of liberalization? The impact is the growth of the service sector. Its share has increased radically from 40% to over 60% of GDP. So we find large expansion of service sector, less expansion of agricultural sector, and stagnated manufacturing sector. But actually, in this service sector, it's not that all the workers will get their job. Mainly the skilled workers will get their job. So what has happened to the unskilled sector? That I'll focus. But before that, let me focus on the different components of reforms. As I said, liberalization includes different types of reforms. Say, for example, industrial sector reforms. It means abolition of industrial licensing from all products, except there are some products, say for example, alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, industrial explosives, electronics, aerospace, drugs, and some of the drugs and pharmaceuticals. So except for that, there was abolition of industrial licensing. Financial sector reforms were there. The role of RBI has been curbed. It's more of a facilitator than a regulator in the context of the financial sector. Some of the decisions can be taken by banks even without consulting the RBI. Say for example, fiscal sector reforms. This is also a part of liberalization. We find that there is continuous reduction in taxes on individual income, and there is a reduction in the rate of corporate tax as well. Till now, we find that there is a reduction in corporate sector tax. And from the year 2017, we find that goods and services tax, GST, has been introduced. Now, if we consider external sector reforms, as I mentioned earlier, that there has been a change in regime from floating exchange rate to fixed exchange rate, to floating exchange rate. Apart from this, some of the quota restrictions were removed. There has been reduction in the tariff rate. So it's a more of a free world as a result of external sector reforms to boost export and imports. If we consider the socio-economic aspects of these reforms, we find that there is increase in disparities of income as a result of this liberalization. As I said, there has been a boom in the private sector, the growth in the private sector without growth in the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector. So it's only the skilled workers who are absorbed in the service sector. So if there is an increase in absorption of skilled workers in the service sector, then what has happened is that, what about the unskilled workers? They either remain unemployed or they are absorbed in the informal sector. So what we find that during the reform, especially under liberalization, there is wide-scale polarization in the economy. On one hand, there is expansion of the service sector, and on the other hand, we find there is expansion of the informal sector. Apart from this, we find as a consequence of expansion of the informal sector, there is rise in poverty and income inequality. There is also inequality in terms of access of in terms of access of health, in terms of education. So we find that overall disparity in the economy as a result of this liberalization regime. Now, if we look at the privatization part, as I said, that it means that shedding of the management of the government sector owned company, and it means that it's selling of these shares to the hands of the private sector. It can be in the form of a private public partnership, PPP type of model, or the ownership is changed from public sector to private sector. Now this is known as disinvestment on part of the government for the public sector companies, or there is complete privatization of a public owned company in the form of ownership transfer. Now, if we consider this, the government has justified over the years that this would help to encourage FDI in those companies, and that would facilitate the management and for smooth functioning of those companies. So these are all aspects of privatization. Then comes the globalization part. It means integrating the whole world under one umbrella. Now, whenever we speak of globalization, as I said, we often say it in terms of removing quota restrictions or removing the reduction of tariff, removing tariff restrictions. But one common thing as a result of globalization is outsourcing. It's an important outcome of globalization due to the rapid expansion of the IT sector or the service sector. It helps to absorb the skilled labor force, not about the unskilled labor force, but a large part of the employment can be provided as a result of this outsourcing by the foreign companies. So this is another aspect of globalization. But of course, there are some missing points of this LPG, liberalization, privatization and globalization. I am not going into the details of the figures which we will find in the write-up, but basically we find that initially the growth rate was low. There was an increase in the growth rate and it reached to a figure like 9.5% during the second phase of globalization, which started from 2000. So the figure 9.5% reached in the year 2005-6. But after that, we find that there has been a slowdown in the growth rate, and there was a fall in the growth rate of around 5% in the year 2013-14. Now, it can be due to various reasons, not only all economic, even political reasons were there. But the fundamental questions that arises, the fundamental questions are, the first fundamental question is, has India's growth been inclusive? Because planners often say that during the planning era, just before the 12th plan, during the 11th plan, that it focuses on inclusive growth rate. But actually whether it's inclusive in terms of poverty, in terms of participation of the workforce, we find that there is jobless growth in the economy. So there are doubts. Has it brought people out of poverty? There are two things that are focused by two eminent economists. One is the view by Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagiria, and they have followed a neoliberal type of view, and they have said that why growth is important, why growth matters. Their view is known as why growth matters. Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagiria wrote a book in 2013, and when they have said that growth is important in tackling poverty, growth due to economic reforms is important in tackling poverty. They cited the example of Brazil in terms of conditional cash transfer, and where they said that it helped to eradicate poverty in Brazil to a large extent. So actually their focus is on more market-based type of approach. Reyes and Amartya Sen, George Reyes and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen challenged this. In the year 2013, they published a book named Uncertain Glory. They described the growth regime, the regime of the planning era from 2008 to 2013 as an uncertain glory. They have said that it should not, India should not focus on growth only. There should not be the growth without development. Rather, they focused on a socio-democratic approach. They said that India should focus on health and education first. People should be literate, and then of course can India think about growth. So maybe the nutrition, lack of nutrition, that is the reason behind this poverty. They can't work, people can't work for a long period. So actually Reyes and Sen's view is just opposite to that of the views of Bhagwati and Panagiria. Now the question is, what happened after that? What happened after their books? There are two famous books, Uncertain Glory and Why Growth Matters. What happened after 2014? In the year 2014, BJP-led central government came to power, and there has been an improvement in the growth rate, stay to around 7.3% in the year 2014-15. But the most controversial issue took place in November 2016, which we know as demonetization. The purpose was digitization of the economy. There are different views related to demonetization. Many economists say that it halted the economic growth in terms of growth of GDP. There was lack of cash in the economy. It halted physical investment, private investment, public investment. All these things were halted. The banking procedure changed. Many people couldn't survive without job. So we all know this, but the main issue was digitization, because Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi raised the slogan at that time, making New India reform, perform and transform. Now, what are the components of this reform, perform and transform? I am not going into the details of this, but the major components of this reform, perform and transform. The strategy was like this. Just to remove the constraints within the economy, first of all, the focus should be on digital India. The second one is Make in India. Make in India means how does it differ from Made in India? In case of Make in India, actually, what we find that it should be produced in India, but foreign collaborations should be there. That means it invites foreign collaboration, it invites FDI. Whereas in case of Made in India, it's just domestically produced, no foreign collaboration. So Narendra Modi focused on Make in India, which is a change in the strategy. Apart from this, India focused on formation of skill formation, which referred to as Skill India. So it means that India should rely on itself, that is known as Atmanirbhar Bharat. So the question arises whether these two are contradictory or not, but actually this is the change in strategy, that Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India, but both of these are essential for development and to remove the structural bottlenecks of the country. Along with this, there is revolution in the tax structure in the form of indirect tax, in the form of introduction of GST. So these are all aspects of making New India. Nowadays, we all have a smartphone. People are becoming savvy with this digitization. So it's just like a computer now, a mobile phone. So actually there is a change in the regime. Structural constraints are tackled in this way by changing strategies. Now what halted economic growth after that? Just after this, we had to face the COVID pandemic, and it started from March 2020 in India. There was lockdown, so economic growth halted, no doubt, at that time. So, but actually that digital India concept helped us, because nowadays we can deal with seminars, conferences, meetings through Google Meet, through Zoom and various other packages. People are more savvy with all these things. So it's a positive side as well. And though the growth halted, it's not only true for India, it's true for all other parts of the world, throughout the world. But India performed quite well in the context of this COVID pandemic, though the growth rate halted for a few years. But after that, India is trying to recover from its shortage of, production, from its low rate of growth. Now, when we come to the conclusions, what we find, if we summarize the whole thing, we find that at the beginning, India started from focus on agricultural development, then shifted its focus on industrialization just to generate employment, but all the plans were not successful. Then again to agricultural development, and finally eradication of poverty. And during the liberalization regime, we find from the socio-economic aspects that of course there is increase in polarization of the economy. Demonetization. After this, since 2014, we find that there is demonetization in 2016, which is controversial, of course, but there was wide-scale digitization in the economy, and it's continuing. India has now focused on making New India in the form of Make in India and Digital and Skill India. India is moving towards that. India has performed quite well after the COVID pandemic, and everyone expects that India will recover its fall in the growth rate during the time of the COVID pandemic for 2 years. So that's the end of the lecture. Thank you.